County doing the work. As Bill says, every 5 years, people who receive CDBG funds are required by the federal government to do an affordable housing, a fair housing assessment. And the fair housing assessment is designed to investigate the region and see whether discrimination is going on. It's against the law to discriminate against people based on race, color, national origin, religion, sex, disability, or family status across the country. It is also against the law in the state of Ohio to discriminate against people based on military status or ancestry status. In the city of Cincinnati, it is also illegal to discriminate against people based on marital status, Appalachian origin, sexual orientation, or transgender status. Housing cannot be based on these factors. It's against the law. And so, what HUD has asked jurisdictions to do is every 5 years, look out over the housing market and figure out whether or not there is discrimination going on. And if that's the case, what's the nature of the discrimination? And what ought to be done to reduce those barriers for protected class households. That's the basis of the report. So, the first question is sort of what's the nature of the housing market and how is the housing market faring? And I think it's fair to say that here in Cincinnati and Southwest Ohio, this community suffered greatly during the recession. And it was a housing-led recession in 2007 and 8. And today in 2018-19, we've largely recovered from the recession. Largely, but not entirely. And I think that what we understand as we look out over the housing market is that there's been real uneven performance in terms of what parts of the community in Hamilton County have recovered and what parts of the community have not. There's been a tremendous amount of revitalization success in downtown and the urban core. And it's been led by all kinds of investment by the city and the county. I think it was really an amazing turnaround and a stabilization of those markets. And that's a good thing. It brought with it, however, some gentrification and displacement. And for protected class households, for which we are concerned in this report, that's a bad thing. And we also understand that on the east side of Hamilton County, markets are strengthening and they are in a much better position than they were pre-recession. Western suburban counties have a more mixed set of outcomes. Some of them are performing better, some of them are performing worse. There are absolutely zones of persistent poverty in the county, and in those places things are getting worse. And then there are these, I think they are sort of, when we talk about integrated communities, these real success stories, which is this, I keep doing this, and I'm going to show you a map in a minute, and you will know why I keep doing this. The sort of north central Hamilton County communities that have for decades been integrated markets. There's black leadership in these communities. School districts are strong. People have generations of stories about being happy with these communities. However, these communities are getting poorer. Their tax revenues are deteriorating, and in a lot of cases, school performance is also deteriorating in these communities. So this is what the map looks like. This is why I keep doing this. In East Hamilton County and West Hamilton County, these are largely segregated white communities. On the east side, markets have recovered and are doing better than they were. On the west side, markets have some recovered, not all recovered. The sort of purple zone there is our urban core, where we've seen a great deal of revitalization. These green neighborhoods, Lower Price Hill, North and South Fairmont, parts of Avondale, parts of Bond Hill and Roselawn, are seeing trends in poverty that are deepening and getting worse. And then these brown communities have been for a very long time the success stories in my mind in Hamilton County around integration, and unfortunately they're seeing markets softening and poverty increasing. So discrimination is a different topic than affordability, but they are very tightly connected. Certainly, the shortage of affordable housing exacerbates all kinds of issues for protected class households. We did surveys all across the county. We did focus groups in geographically based areas. We also did focus groups with protected class households to ask them how their housing worked for them and how easily they had a time finding housing. And what we found was that overt discrimination, I will not rent you a unit because you have too many kids and I don't want to deal with it, somebody overtly saying to another, I'm not going to rent to you, or I'm not going to sell to you based on your protected class characteristic, happened most often with families with young children, and it also happened often with people with disabilities. And the conversation there goes, I don't want to deal with this, I don't have the money, you don't have the money to make the accommodation, I just don't want to deal with it. And that's overt discrimination, and it's illegal, and it happens all the time. Young people, foster children, foster adults aging out of the system are very unsupported in this region, and they have a really hard time. Age isn't necessarily a protected class characteristic, but LGBTQ status is, and often those folks have LGBTQ characteristics, and they get discriminated against. Young people and families with children often do not complain. They don't go to home, they don't raise cases, because young people figure nobody's going to listen to them, there's not going to be an outcome to the complaint, and it's just going to be a bother. Often young families with children are worried that their children will be taken away. They're worried that if they're demonstrating housing insecurity, that somebody's going to take their children away. So oftentimes, those folks who are experiencing overt discrimination are not complaining. The single biggest protected class who file cases with home are households with disabilities. There's another kind of discrimination that I also want to talk about. I'm going to call it systematic discrimination. It isn't that anybody said, no, I won't rent a unit to you. But if you'll recall the map I showed you, all those red zones in the community, those are all communities that have less than 5% of their population African American, less than 5% of their population poor. So lots of times people just don't even know that Anderson Township is a thing, or that Delhi Township is the place that there might be a unit, because they just have no network there. The bus doesn't go there, they don't know anyone who lives there, they've never been there to ask. And so often that sort of systematic discrimination that definitely impacts the kind of choices that people have in ways that they may not even be aware of. There's also discrimination in this region based on market dynamics. It's a good thing that we're revitalizing the urban core. It is a good thing that that downtown and over the Rhine are improving, and we needed to make investments in those communities. But it has absolutely resulted in displacement. And in neighborhoods where the historic population has been low income, African American, that displacement is very difficult, because now that the housing market is getting better, there isn't anywhere else to go. And these are neighborhoods that are their neighborhoods. And so this kind of market discrimination has definitely been a problem. And I would say that the lack of affordable housing exacerbates all of it, right? If every time the market makes it harder to find a unit, people are putting up with some very poor property conditions because they are not sure that they're going to find another unit. What we know also is that we all, when we look for housing, are looking for a place that serves our needs, right? It's about the house, but it's also about the neighborhood. It's about how close we are to the things that we need to access every day, schools, churches, jobs. And there are some parts of the community that have better access to healthy food, to parks, to things that we would all like in our neighborhoods, and places where it's not. And so this is a summary document that's available for the report. There's also a big fat report. And one of the things that we realized in the big fat report, where there's lots of mapping around access to quality schools, access to jobs, access to green space, is that the map keeps looking the same. The places where poor access occur are the same places where persistent poverty occurs. And so one of the reasons for this sort of summary map, if you will, was that that map just keeps looking the same. We know that air quality and water quality are worse in protected class neighborhoods where protected class households are concentrated. We know that protected class households are likely to be living in housing in poor condition. Immigrants are protected classes, and some of the stories that we heard in the immigrant community about the conditions of housing they were living in were really shocking. And they too are not going to complain because they're afraid they're going to get deported, and they're afraid nobody's going to do anything if they complain. They don't understand how to navigate the system, and so lots of those conditions go unaddressed. The other thing we understand is that access to capital for mortgages for low-income homeowners are not equal. Access to capital to make home improvements are not equal. We're seeing Black households much less likely to be having mortgages at low interest rates and home improvement loans at low interest rates. And so the access to capital to take care of your unit is not the same. The Fair Housing Assessment asks us to do something else. In addition to summarizing what's going on in the market, they also ask us to say what ought to happen to mitigate these problems. If there are barriers, and there are, the question becomes what would the region do? And so we've characterized recommendations in two ways. There are definitely not enough resources going toward this issue. We are not spending enough money on affordable housing, on protecting protected classes, on the kinds of good services that are designed to protect protected classes. And there are big system changes that need to take place. There are systems that are working against protected class households. So in the category of resources, we're making a recommendation to establish a housing trust fund, a city and a county. I want to give the city and the county both credit for doing this work together. I think it made perfect sense to look at Hamilton County as one big zone because that's the way people live in this region anyway. Nobody really is all that focused on the city limits. And a housing trust fund, both of them are talking about a housing trust fund. I don't know that it will be one or two, but I think that's a positive recommendation in both jurisdictions. Talking about creating a catalytic economic and community development investment fund for those north central Hamilton County communities. There are communities that are integrating, that are willing to support protected class households, and we want to support those communities who are willing to support protected class households. And lots of them are small political jurisdictions that don't always have the resources to do the kind of redevelopment projects that would result in more housing by themselves. And so a fund that they could use to do site development, acquisition is really both in economic development and housing terms. We're also talking about supporting regional and community-based organizations that create affordable housing. That might be community development corporations, and certainly community development corporations. It might be the port, it might be LISC. Community organizations that create housing need to be supported and need to be capitalized. We're also talking about supporting agencies who protect protected class households. That's home, that's legal aid. The number of households that get evicted that have legal representation is something like less than 10%. Landlords who file evictions are 90% of the time represented by counsel. Tenants are less than 10% of the time represented by counsel. And not surprisingly, most of the determinations are in favor of the landlord, not the tenant. And legal aid, our legal aid, this is as an example, I think is one of the best in class legal aids in the country. I mean, they do an amazing job and they cannot keep up. They cannot keep up anywhere near what we're doing. There are some big systems that work against integrated housing, and one of them is the transportation system. I talked about this a little bit. If you don't even know where Anderson Township is and you can't get out there, it doesn't feel like a choice to you. And our public transportation system is not serving the full region in a way that would mean that lots of communities would feel like an option for people who wanted them. We need to create lending products that work for protected class households, both in terms of, there are lots of low-income homeowners in Hamilton County, and it's hard to take care of a unit if you don't have the funds to do that, or can't get a mortgage or a second to do that. We need to improve housing crisis response. There are a lot of organizations out here who somebody who's getting evicted or is leaving a home has the number to, and it's just really hard. There's a big hole on the day that you get evicted in terms of where services are and what you can access. People's stories are, you're on hold for hours and hours and hours, or you get sent to agency A and then to agency B, 2 hours worth of lines in both agencies and no support. Now, partly that's suggest, but it's also about the systems in place to respond to people when they're in crisis. We also need to engage in active, consistent, professional code enforcement. All three of those words are relevant. Building conditions are a big deal, and there are lots of very poor building conditions in the county. One of the things that has happened as the funds for affordable housing have transferred from largely federal public funds to largely private market funds around housing choice vouchers. The only people who are paying attention to building conditions are the inspectors in the jurisdictions that those housing units belong in or live in. And if it's a part-time code enforcement person who isn't connected to technology and doesn't have a systematic way to process complaints or to do systematic inspections, building conditions suffer. And in lots of places in the county, that is so. Consistent, active code enforcement. The city's rental registration program is a start. It's a good start. It's a good step in that direction. It's about consistently inspecting rental property as it turns over, and that's an important thing. We need to be doing more inspection, and we need to be holding property owners accountable for the conditions of the property that people live in. And finally, the third rail of this conversation, which is zoning codes. There are lots and lots of fairly restrictive zoning codes throughout the county that in many places in the county, particularly in the east side and the west side, there's no multifamily zoning allowed by right. What that means is there are no zoning categories that you can just build a multifamily house. Mostly those units get created in planned unit developments that have lots of process and lots of opportunity for political jurisdictions to say no, which happens regularly. Now, political jurisdictions have the right to do their own zoning, absolutely. But if we want to create a more integrated community where protected class households have choices all over the county, we're going to have to identify in different places. Nobody wants to hear that term, but it's a systematic issue that absolutely restricts choice in the region. So that is a quick spin around the Fair Housing Report. As I said, there's a summary document which Bill has, and if you are really interested and you want to dig into the full document, it's on the county's website and it's on the city's or on CBI's website.
And I'll put it on Air Inc. website also.
And I would say to you, it's probably not the most exciting reading you're ever going to do. However, there are lots of maps and there's lots of data. So if you're working on grants, as an example, or you're thinking about wanting to put some kind of a proposal together, there's a lot of good information in there, good data. And Bill, I'm going to stop now.
All right, well, thank you, Liz.
Oh, can I do one more thing?
Sure. Oh,
Because I forgot. So the Fair Housing Assessment is a document that gets produced for HUD and submitted. It certainly drives what the county does. We hope it will drive what the city does. There are two efforts going on right now. The county is working on their consolidated plan, and they are very much taking this Fair Housing Assessment into account as they do that work. It is the document that will help them focus how they spend their CDBG funding going forward in is it a 2-year document? A 5-year document. It's a 5-year document as well. And then LISC and Greater Cincinnati Foundation are leading an effort to put together a comprehensive housing strategy, which will also be done in 2020, and it too is being informed by this work. So there are ongoing efforts to sort of take this to the next step, which I think are good. Now I'll stop.
great. Well, thank you very much, Liz.
Yep.